Hi, welcome to study number 7 in the Gospel of Mark. We're glad you're with us. Appreciate your participation from students literally all over the world. We thank you for joining us in this Bible study together. We're going to be in Mark, the second chapter, and starting at verse 13 in a moment. But I do want to make an announcement aimed at our South Side folks, and specifically those who attend Sunday evening services at the South Side Church in Rogers. From this Sunday until through the end of this year, we will not be meeting on Sunday nights. We're going to be assuming a holiday schedule early. We are missing many Sundays anyway in the evening time because of vacations coming up, the Thanksgiving holiday, among other things. And as the weather turns colder and as we have had a fresh outbreak of COVID-19, we thought it was best to at least postpone meeting again until after the first of the year. So we'll probably be restarting January the 10th. A lot of that depends on the weather. We have no idea what to expect, but just out of an abundance of caution and simply because of the coming holiday, we will not be meeting anymore on Sunday nights this year. We appreciate your understanding that. And of course, these opportunities for Bible study, as well as morning services on Sunday, they will continue on unless things change, unless we have even more of a spike. But we're watching this situation. Our church leaders are being careful, and so I very much appreciate that. And we will not be meeting on Sunday night anymore. I was thinking that probably over 90% of our Sunday night crowd is in high risk. We're over 65 years of age, only a handful of people above that, and we've only had a couple of people that needed to take the Lord's Supper. So the decision was made to go ahead and move up our holiday schedule out of abundance of caution and because we're coming up on the holidays anyway. So let's go on. Study number 7 in Mark. Want to say this, 3 quick points. Number 1, Mark moves quickly and he tells his own story in his own way. Points 1 and 2. Point number 2, point number 1, Mark moves quickly. He has Jesus bouncing about, going here and there. Sometimes it's a bit confusing as to where is. And then he tells his own story in his own way. So be sure that you read Mark on his own merits. At least once, try to understand that Mark has his narrative to tell. The storyline, the third point that I wanted to review is the storyline is that the Son of God has landed on planet Earth and the divine invasion has begun and the kingdom is coming quickly to the earth in the person of Jesus Christ. In study number 6 last week, we marveled at Christ's power, his ability to heal a paralytic, but the scene was fun. I mean, when you consider that 4 men broke through the roof of a house, down through the ceiling, so that they could get their friend in front of Jesus who was paralyzed. And Jesus, instead of healing the man immediately, he forgave his sin first and then healed him. But we're not going to linger here long because that was last week's study. If you need to go back over study number 6, you've got the opportunity to do that anytime. So we're moving on to number 7. Let's begin with our text, Mark chapter 2, verse 13. And I'll read a couple of verses at a time so as to try to explain the things that are developing. 2:13, Mark. He went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Jesus bounces back to the Sea of Galilee after being in Capernaum for a brief time. And the Sea of Galilee is that freshwater lake that's at the north part of Palestine that runs through the Jordan River all the way down to the Dead Sea. So he's teaching there. And then he sees this guy, Levi, who is at a tax desk. He is the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. Now, Levi, he has a glorious Jewish name, that of the priestly tribe. So it would follow that this employee of the Roman government was of the tribe that would serve in the temple. And here he wasn't serving in the temple. In fact, he was a traitor to many people, to the Jewish people. The gospel writer Matthew self-identifies Levi as Matthew, the tax collector. But here in Mark, he's identified as Levi. You ever wondered why? That was Matthew's other name? You wouldn't get this thought line in Matthew or in Luke or any other of the Gospels, but you do get it in Mark. Consider for a moment the significance of the name Levi. This fellow Levi is from one of the most privileged tribes in Israel, a holy tribe. The Levites were fed from the tithes of Israel as they waited in the temple and the tabernacle. Levites didn't get any land allotment, but the Lord told them he would be their inheritance. They would camp the closest to the tabernacle on the north, south, and east and west because they were always being called upon to serve in the tabernacle. And here is this fella who probably should be serving in the temple in some way, probably a Levite being named Levi, and instead he has chosen money and power over holiness, over national loyalty, or so it would appear. So that's why it's important that we note this fellow's name was Levi. We know he was Matthew, but his other name was Levi. So we move to verse 15 of chapter 2. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." We'll talk about tax collectors. We talked about Levi. Let's look at the other characters in this story, the tax collectors. They were all at the party that Levi threw for Jesus in his home. If I may say so, and I suppose you probably might too, I don't like getting mail from the Internal Revenue Service. In fact, of all of the agents of the government, state, local, or federal, I dislike receiving documents from the Internal Revenue Service more than anything else from the government. Those formalized, computer-friendly mailer envelopes containing tax documents, it usually means it's either time to pay taxes, or you didn't pay enough, or your returns are being reviewed and corrected and you owe tax. It's funny how you never get a note telling your return is being reviewed and you're owed money. It's always, we're reviewing you and we think you owe more money. But these first century tax guys were not even that civil. They were governed by a fellow named Herod Antipas, who was governor of Galilee. And he was of this Herodian family. And I can pretty safely say there were no good guys in the Herodian family. They were all murderous, killing politicians. And here's how you get a job as a tax guy from Herod Antipas or any other Roman government official at the time that this was done. You bid for the job. Yes, you heard me correctly. You weren't technically an employee of the Roman government. You would be technically subcontracted by the Roman government. Actually, legally what happened was you leased the people's taxes, the people's income, as you could tax it at a certain amount. Meaning if you had 1,000, let's say you bid 1,000 pieces of silver that you could tax from the people of Capernaum, just a random figure. Some other guy comes up and says, "I think I can get $1,200 out of Capernaum residents." The fellow who bid 1,200 silver pieces would be the one to get the job. So there was a great deal of motivation on the part of the tax collector to meet the bid that he had made. He had subcontracted for that amount of money, and he was expected to deliver on that amount of money. That's how Levi got his job. Because of this, his own people, the Jews, considered him an apostate, and they treated him as unclean, as an outcast. You weren't welcome in the synagogue. He was a disgrace to his family. You notice in Mark, you see a lot of outcast people whom Jesus loved and cared for, forgave and healed. Levi was among this motley crew of people who became one of the 12 apostles, not just one of his random disciples, not one of the 70, not one of the thousands that followed. It's possible that Levi was even there on the shores of the Sea of Galilee taking fish as withholding tax from the fishermen. That is actually, they have found ancient inscriptions that show that tax collectors would go to bodies of water and tax by fish. If you came home with 10 fish, he'd tax you 2 fish. I don't know if you sold them or not. Maybe you just had dinner, but you taxed fish. Jesus calls Levi to follow him. This guy who subcontracts for Herod Antipas. And Levi is absolutely thrilled, throws a party with his only friends, undoubtedly, in the whole world, tax collectors. They were the only friends he had. He probably didn't have any Jewish friends, at least not until Jesus added him to this band of 12 merry apostles. Anyway, we have this happening, and he's reclining at the table, and Jesus was there with his disciples and these outcasts from the synagogue and Jewish life in general, and they're all eating with Jesus. And this is table fellowship. And while this may not mean much to us today, although people do consider, I think by default, we consider table fellowship in someone's home, being served a meal in someone's home as a special honor. Anymore, we meet at restaurants. But if someone invites you to their home to eat, that really is kind of a sacred moment. And here they are enjoying table fellowship, Jesus is, with this motley group of tax collectors, these outcasts who weren't even allowed in the synagogue and were not any part of polite society, Jewish society. And not only that has he gone to eat with them, but he's made one of these guys, one of his inner 12, his special 12 servants, the apostles. And since Levi has a lot of money, there are a lot of people there. The proper folks, the synagogue attending folks, are watching this. The experts in the law are watching this. The conservative types who don't like mingling with such unsavory characters, they wouldn't be there, but they would be watching and seething with rage. This party had been thrown open to anybody who wanted to be there. The only reason the scribes and Pharisees weren't there is not because they weren't invited. They very well might have been. It's that they didn't want to have any part of that party. The Jewish church folks, the watchdogs of the faith, went to Christ's disciples and said, Why is your rabbi eating with sinners and tax collectors, the outcasts? Why eat with such loathsome people? And Jesus did not give his apostles a chance to answer that question. You notice they went around Jesus' back to ask the question of the apostles, and Jesus gives the answer, which is an old proverb from somewhere. It says, if you're well, you don't need a doctor. It's, I've come to invite sinners, not the supposedly righteous. And let me go off just on a tangent for a moment, hopefully a productive tangent. I want to come to the defense of the Jewish critics here. Well, maybe not a defense, but an explanation for why they thought the way they did. Jews have always been in a battle for their identity and even for their own survival. Jews were nearly wiped out in the Holocaust here just 70 years ago. More than 70, about 75 years ago, as several million people were killed. Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. The Jews had a history of being oppressed and exiled and hated and being treated in a prejudicial way. It had a history twice as long as the United States had been in existence. of being exiled and enslaved and being oppressed by Assyrians and Babylonians and then Greeks and then different shades of Romans. They had fought hard to maintain their national identity while being subsumed, if you will, into a secular pagan culture. They're fighting for their identity. And they formed synagogues. We don't have exact history on it, but we know they formed synagogues sometime during the Babylonian exile. And that was a good effort. I mean, they wanted to learn the law, they wanted to follow the law, and so they built a body of tradition around all of the law of Moses. And they would teach this tradition in the synagogue. And it was in order for Jews to maintain their holiness, their place as God's special people. And that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. They would find one another to support one another in this strange land that they lived in. These distinctives of the Jewish people were taught largely by people who eventually became the Pharisee sect, the scribes and experts of the law, who copied the law, who studied the law, who dotted the I's and crossed the T's. They were very careful about the law and its exactness, that they saw the law as the vessel in which the holiness of God would be given to people. And so there was a strong allegiance to the law. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Of course not. I think the Jewish defensiveness about this had started as well-intentioned. It had begun as a well-intentioned effort to defend the faith in a time of great unbelief or a time of various beliefs. And you can see that even in our own culture, how many Christians almost live a monastic lifestyle in order to remain distinctive from the world, because you got so much stuff going on around you that's unrighteous and unholy and violent and hateful and all of that going on. And so you want to maintain your distinctiveness. The Jews had a great calling to this, and these Pharisees were part of it. In fact, the word Pharisee comes from a word which means separate. So this idea of separateness was never meant to be snooty, snarky, I'm better than you. It was, we're the holy people of God. But it became snarky, snooty, conceited, and prideful. They believed that what they had built was bigger than the kingdom of God. And so they erected a wall, as it were, of doctrine and tradition that was unscalable. To follow the law, you had to scale this wall. To be holy like God wanted you to be holy meant that you had to keep very stringent rules about fasting and prayer and about who you spent your time with. They had failed. The prophets had cried out for distinctiveness, had cried out for the people to come out from among them and be holy. That's prophetic. That's true. But it did not mean that you should isolate yourself from the world. And so they morphed into something that didn't even resemble the kingdom of God, something that God had never wanted for Israel. Judaism began to look more like a museum than a hospital for broken people. The kingdom of God was meant to be a vessel, an oracle, if you will, for the whole world to hear about God's word. Instead, they took this well, this fountain of holy knowledge, and they kept it to themselves. And they protected it from people who had no worthiness to be near it, pagans and Gentiles. That's why it's always we have to be so careful when we look at people and we say, boy, that's up, and we give them a name, or they've got that moral problem, or they are that greedy and terrible and horrible, or they're power hungry, or they're famous and conceited. We can go on and point fingers at people, and we end up being just like the Pharisees, just like the ones that wanted to erect this wall around God to keep unworthy people away. And what you're telling the world then is, I'm the only one worthy of him. And Jesus spent his entire ministry refusing to recognize that there was any wall at all. He would go to this party with these with these deplorables, if you will. And he would work with them and talk with them and laugh with them and play with them. And boy, the scribes and Pharisees just didn't get it. They had wanted to make Judaism distinctive, and they had, but they had hoarded it all to themselves, and they made it impossible for people to follow the law. And Jesus said, look here, I've come to heal sick people. I've come to open up the well and let people have a drink of this, of God, of the kingdom of God. It's very easy, I think, and probably a good parable for us, that it's easy to take that one fateful step from being having a holy distinctiveness to being a prideful, closed society meant only for the already good. It has happened in the church, and it has happened among believers of all tribes in Christianity, not just true of my own tribe. We have built buildings and modeled churches as businesses, and we've elected church leaders and boards of elders. We've institutionalized what was once a movement. The Jesus movement of the first century eventually solidified into the institution that it is today, complete with walls. We want to be entertained, or at the very least, wowed by the divine. We forgot about people, or we made people our goal, not people's souls, but just the numbers. If we can get more people to come, people become the means to the end instead of the end. The reason that we do this, the reason that we tell the story is people. Churches that forget that the gospel is for everybody, even loathsome people, people we hate. The church, which is the embodiment of Jesus Christ in the world, has forgotten that the gospel, that Jesus spent lots of time with people who we would not have much to do with ourselves. Jesus isn't asking us to run with sinners, but he desires us to look for the loathsome, the folks we might not spend time with, and see if they want to run with us and with Jesus. That's what we're looking for. Let's continue to move through the story, and we'll go to verse 18 of chapter 2. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." The issue that was brought up by the Jews in this case was now fasting. So we've gone from eating with sinners and deplorable, loathsome people in the eyes of the the religious folks of the day. Now we've gone to the question of fasting. And I'll tell you that devoted Jews in the first century fasted 2 days a week. They fasted on Monday and they fasted on Thursday. We get that from ancient documents. They only fasted from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., which mean the daylight hours they didn't eat. But in the evening time, they could eat. It's a whole lot like Ramadan in the way that they fasted back then. But Jesus' apostles did not fast, even though devoted Jews would fast twice a week. Jesus explained it this way. He said, "Why would the wedding guests fast when the bridegroom is present?" Wait a minute now. What exactly does that mean? Well, the law prescribed only one day of enforced fasting. Just FYI, there was only one day that people were by law told to fast, and that was the Day of Atonement. 10th day, 7th month of the Jewish calendar. And by the time of Jesus' ministry, the Jews had formed a tradition where they fasted 2 days a week, Mondays and Thursdays, and it would go from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. It would go from 6 p.m. rather to 6 a.m. I think I misspoke earlier. Well, now let's talk about a wedding, okay? And how's that got to do with fasting? Everything about a wedding is anti-fasting in Jewish culture. I mean, completely. You know, with the privations these poor folks had to suffer in the first century, with droughts and difficulty and poverty, and you had the rich being really rich and the poor being very poor, and you had probably very few in the actual middle class, having enough to eat was usually a challenge day by day. Having more than enough to eat was only available at the time of a wedding feast. And they would feast for a week or two as the family of the bride would just put on a great feast for everyone. And and it was an open house, generally an open house, so that anybody who wanted to come and celebrate the wedding, the formation of a new family, was welcome to do that. And in a hard life like this, the wedding week or weeks was really the happiest week of a person's life. It was meant to be that way. There was no lack of food and there was no lack of fun. And during that week, your closest friends would come and visit you, sometimes from far distances and sometimes near. And wedding guests were specifically exempted from fasting. So the Monday and Thursday fast, you didn't have to fast for 2 weeks. That'd be missing 4 fasting days if you were at a wedding. Interesting, isn't it? So he says, let's rejoice. The bridegroom is here. The wedding party is on. And then he said, in a foreboding way, he said, but one day the bridegroom's going to be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. So he sees ahead very early on in his ministry. This is at the very beginning of his ministry. He already sees what's coming, is that one day the bridegroom will be taken from them. Now, he uses the example of wineskins and fabric too, to make a point about our hearts and our minds. Those of us who would be new. Jesus did not come to reform people. He came to make people new. Absolutely and completely new. In the ways they think, the ways they act, in the ways they love, new. Not reformed, but new. As wine ferments, it expands. There are gases that are expelled from the fermenting juice of the grape as it produces alcohol in the wine. And you would need a sheep's stomach. That's usually what you used, or a goat stomach. And you would use an animal's stomach, and you would put your wine in there after you've cleaned it out, of course. And what would happen would be that thing would eventually kind of look like a hard ball. I mean, it would just be inflated with wine gases as the wine is fermenting. Now, if you put a new wine, in other words, a lightly fermented wine that's still not completely fermented yet, has gone through the fermentation process, you're going to put that in an old, stiff wineskin that's going to burst the skins. You lose the wine, you lose the skin, okay? And I would assume that skins were pretty valuable because he mentions you lose the skin too. You don't want to lose that. He said what you do is when you have new wine that's not completely fermented, you take a new wineskin that still has its flexibility and its malleability, and it will just puff out. Eventually it will contract, but it will puff out, and it will hold in the gases that will cause the wine to become wine. And he said, you can't put new wine into an old wineskin. You can't put a new life, a new way of living, a new way of thinking about salvation, something that's not based on law, but is based on love. You can't pour that into an old template of understanding. You can't just give that to someone and then them understand it. It'll just blow their minds, I guess. It'll explode the wineskin of someone who's not willing to expand and to continue to learn. And Jesus was saying here that the kingdom was never meant to make bad people good or good people better. He came to make all people new, brand new, forgiven, full of love and full of purpose and joy, an abundant life. Fresh minds like fresh skins that can expand and learn and then respond in kingdom ways. That's what he was talking about. Jesus also illustrated by using the example of a new fabric and when, a new garment, and when you wash it, the new shrinking fabric will rip away at the patch or that's made out of the new fabric, rather. So you have this older fabric which is not shrinking, but you've got this new patch, and the new patch will shrink, and it will tear away from the old garment. It says same thing. He's saying exactly the same thing. He's just illustrating it in a couple of different ways. One of the most important things I think we need to learn as Christians is that we must never stop learning. We need to have new stories to tell of God's goodness to us. We need to be open to new insights from the Scriptures. If we cannot be taught anything new, if we're not open to learning new truth, or we resist any effort to teach us something different simply because it isn't the way that I've always thought about things, we will die intellectually and spiritually, because things that don't grow eventually die. So keep your minds open to new things, to new learning. One last thing. Let's shoot the drone up in the air to look down at this whole situation as we've looked at his confrontation with those who doubted him in the last couple of weeks. As Christ initiates his mission to invade the world with good news that people would believe, he has irritated some folks terribly. The enemy is not who you would think. The enemy is not the pagan, the unbeliever, the dirty, or as I've said, the deplorable, who believes in no God at all. The enemy is the good, religious man who believes in God, who believes that being right is more important than anything else. That you believe right, you act right, and you don't spend time with those who don't believe right and act right. And that's the enemy now. That's the enemy. So the story of Mark is, as this invasion continues, he faced head on in chapter 1 with Satan in chapter 1. But when you get to chapter 2, you start seeing opposition from the very people you would think would recognize Jesus. The scribes and Pharisees, who knew the prophets best of all, who knew there was something unusual and different about this man. But because Jesus, wasn't one of them, they didn't accept him and they didn't believe in him. So he's asserting his authority as the kingdom comes. And the kingdom was coming, and there was nothing the enemies of Christ could do about it, because Jesus Christ is the kingdom. He has come to take over the world and to make good people new and bad people new, and make all people one in their newness together. And, don't lose heart. Don't lose heart. The bad news of the past few weeks with COVID-19, the numbers growing, has been hard to hear, because we've already been through 8 months of this, almost 9 months of this. But I want you to know that Jesus is greater than any disease. The healing power that he has is greater than this world. It's greater than the hate. He has all the power, and we live in that power because we live in him. The work of the gospel continues as the Lord waits for people to turn and obey him. I really appreciate you joining us today. That's about as far as we're going to get. We'll pick up at verse 23 in Mark 2 in our next study, but this has been Mark study number 7. I surely do appreciate your viewing this, and I hope it's a blessing to you. Thank you.